Hello, Abby. How you doing? Got your work up right here, and great image, by the way. Okay, so Kyoto, Japan. Really good job. Great introduction. Good little historical background of Japan, Tokyo, with their recent activity and future upcoming activity in terms of bidding for host cities for the Olympics. Um, Also, you know what? In your final, you can also talk about now Japan is there's always world championships and semi championships and world cups and all sorts of different things in Japan. So I think it would be really valuable to go ahead and address those. What sorts of events have been held in Kyoto and neighboring areas in the last, let's say, 20 years? And if so, once you uncover those events that have been held there, you can also take a look at pre-existing structures that can be either retrofitted or modernized to accommodate a modern Olympics. So that's really important too. So show what is already there and what will need to be built. Um, Give a little bit of history. That's great. The weather, you talk about weather, that's good. One thing I would recommend here is you talk about the average temperature. Talk about average snowfall, the type of snow it is. So in other words, we want to know if the snowfall would accommodate Winter Olympic events without the necessity of having to make fake snow. And again, you can pick um, pieces of research from the IOC, International Olympic Committee, and their recommendations on the temperature range for a Winter Olympic event, and then compare that with the temperature ranges of Kyoto proper. Um, you talk about hotels, 1,091 hotels in Kyoto. But also talk about the hotels, and you did kind of touch on the hotels in the neighboring areas, which of course, you know, the post right before yours where was that? Karen's post. And take a read through her post because she did something really interesting, and she talked about splitting the games up into different zones, which is quite often it does actually happen. So in other words, her city was Denver. Her host city was Denver, but she talked about having events all the way up in Colorado Springs or down in Colorado Springs and in Vail and some other neighboring areas, as well as downtown Denver. So that is good. And then what you would do from there is you would research the number of hotel rooms that are available, let's say in a 100-mile radius from each location, just to make sure that we know that there's enough hotel space for the athletes, for the politicians, for the media, et cetera, et cetera. Um, you talk about the number of hotel rooms, but go ahead and point to how many hotel rooms the International Olympic Committee requests or requires, and also talk about how many athletes alone and how many media members are will be at this event. So that would be a really good idea to separate, you know, how many rooms are available and then how many are available for guests or family or whatever, because typically media and athletes themselves will stay, you know, very close to the central location of the events that they are participating in. So I would say the Olympic Village would be located in Kyoto proper, and that would be where some of the opening and closing ceremony events and some of the major events would be. Okay, and again, all of this points to research, so keep up the great job on the research. Um, okay, this is good. You talk more about the hotel space. Then you talk a little bit about the efficiency of the public transportation system, but you really want to get into that. Talk a little bit about if that public transportation system is available, is capable of accommodating transportation for, in many cases, what would be over 1 million people. So that's really, really an important consideration that would point, again, to research. Talk about the historical buildings, and I think that's good. I want to give all the design elements of games a culturally appropriate modern style, but without being too cheesy. I think that's really smart. I get what you're saying here, and I think it's really, really a very, very valid point. When we think of Japan, we think of, you know, the Imperial Sun. We think of some of the, you know, like iconic um, visual representations and the encoded visual representations associated with Japan. And I think it's smart to try to stay away from that tradition a little bit in order not to be too predictable in the project. I hope that makes sense. I think it does, because you definitely talked about that right here without being too cheesy. Okay, and then just my basic hit list, which I've been talking about, is a lot of these things right here. Okay, so talk about the weather. Right, we talked about that. Venues for sporting events. We really want to talk about that. Are they available? Are they able to be used? And that would definitely point in the right direction for a host city if there are several available venues that will either be retrofitted or somehow modernized to accommodate a modern Olympic event. Accommodations for coaches, athletes, media, and nearby venues. Talked about that. Consideration for athletes' families. Talked about that. That's all with hotel rooms. And the transportation infrastructure, I mentioned that. That's important. Energy infrastructure. Is this location able to hold the kind of, not only cell towers, but the power grid? Is it able to hold this kind of convergence of this mass media on this location? Talk a little bit about nightlife and restaurants. This is leisure activities for participants, for participants and guests and spectators while there's no event, specifically in the nightlife. And so talk about nightlife, restaurants, dance clubs, museums, etc., for people to do leisure activities while they're not spectating sports. Public safety is a big one too. Is this location able to accommodate the safety of 1 million people? Let's say roughly 1 million people, including athletes and spectators, etc. Talked about rich cultural heritage. We talked about that. Environmental sustainability is another big one. Political climate is the area prone to terror attacks. Sad thing to say, but it is part of our reality. Is there military escalations in the areas? Is there any sort of problems or anything that should be considered there? I talked about medical accommodations, natural disasters. The one thing I want to talk about is the carbon footprint. We talked about a lot of locations that don't want the Olympics in their area, in their countries, because of the negative carbon footprint that's left behind. And we've all seen those stories and films about old Olympic venues that are left to ruin. You see an old bobsled track that's just filled with weeds, and they just left it to ruin, and that's a concern. So talk about the carbon footprint too. Other than that, I think you've done a really good job. Hospitals and clinics, obvious stuff like that. Talked about public transportation and your visual inspiration, so get rid of those. All right, so that's what I have now. Just kind of wrap it up, get things really in good working order, so that with your final submission, somebody should be able to pick this up, know exactly what you're talking about, know exactly what your intent is, and ultimately be able to say, hey, you know what, from a complete layman's point of view, I think this is a good location based on what I just read. So, but what you don't want to do is leave any questions open. Like, for example, you wouldn't want to say, you wouldn't want somebody to pick up your paper, read your paper, and say, well, wait a second, where are all these people going to stay? I hope that makes sense. The best example I can come up with on the fly, so I hope that makes sense. All right, fantastic job. Any questions? Or if I can clarify anything, Abby, just let me know and I'll be glad to do so. All right, fantastic job. Thanks so much for sharing.